Yo, what is going on, guys? J.Yumeko here, and welcome to Crimson Gray, Dusk and Dawn. This is the sequel to Crimson Gray, which we played on this channel. The first game, we were basically a depressed high school student, and we ended up hooking up, essentially, with this psychotic yandere type character. And so basically it was hinting at, oh, well, the girl's mother was a test subject for this sketchy pharmaceutical company, and she may have become so mentally deranged because of those tests while the mother was pregnant. So that's kind of the idea here. Now, whether this is going to dig more into that, or this is just kind of the after high school relationship that they have, because I believe that they ran away or something like that. So yeah, but without further ado, let's jump right on into it, shall we? Start. Author's note, this game is a direct sequel to the original Crimson Gray and will make less sense if you didn't play the first one. Well, on that note, if you guys do want to check out the first Crimson Gray playthrough that I did, then you can go ahead and check it out in the playlist that I made of it. I highly recommend it. It was honestly a very fun story and a very good game. So yeah, but let's jump right on into this one. Alright, review the story so far. I'll go play the first one. I played the first one. Oh, there it is. Oh, we're in college, I guess. The melancholy melody echoed within her, and Lizzie clung to it. I'm gonna turn up the volume a little bit. I feel like maybe it's a little bit quiet now compared to the main menu. There's a time when the melody hadn't been within her, though she preferred not to think about that time. That was before she met him. The melody was sad, but it was his, and so she loved it, and it was certainly better than emptiness. Lizzie had expected that meeting her special person would change everything, and it had, but to her surprise, it didn't happen all at once. Instead, they both grew and changed, their life together becoming ever more wonderful and her mind growing to encompass it. Yet she had a difficult time pinpointing exactly when she had first heard the melody. It would have been romantic if it had appeared at some momentous occasion, such as when she met him, or when they first made love, or on some future day when they were finally married. But instead it had slowly emerged, whispering at the edges of her mind. Smiling to herself, Lizzie began to contemplate the beginnings of the melody more thoroughly, but at that moment her world was disrupted by two people approaching her. Her eyes flickered over their substanceless bodies, analyzing everything about them. She distantly knew the girl's name, had only seen the boy on several occasions. Both sophomores like John and her. No physical threat. Lizzie had seen the two of them holding hands on the campus green, and from pupil dilation judged them to be a couple, so unlikely to be a threat to her relationship. But now they were approaching her. She put on her usual smile and considered them more carefully. The boy was normal enough, but the girl, she was rather pretty, and she dressed fairly well. It would take so little for her to show off what she had. Was that a teasing glint in her eye? Lizzie's smile widened just a bit, and she reclassified the girl as a minor threat. Hey, sorry to interrupt. It's Lizzie, right? That's right. Nice to meet you. She responded politely as they introduced themselves, only tracking the information for future reference. Once, putting on a friendly mask had been difficult for her, an imitation of something she'd only observed. Now she could fake it more easily, mirroring real emotions she had when she was with him. It irritated her to waste her smiles on random people who didn't matter, though. So as soon as possible, Lizzie encouraged them to get to the point. We're trying to start social things for other couples on campus. They may be about the same age, but hanging out with single college kids just isn't the same, you know? We don't have many people yet, so if you have any ideas, we're open to them. Either of you, your husband's name is John, right? Why did she know his name? Lizzie's smile became brittle as she stared over the girl again, searching for the slightest tick that might give her away. She had played it off like she wasn't sure about his name, but she knew. Lizzie was sure of it. Perhaps her analysis of the threat was wrong. She had dismissed them as a couple, but neglected to consider how impure most love was. This girl might ignore her partner and target John. Or they could be one of those sexually adventurous couples she'd read about, prowling for other couples. Lizzie had not given a single real thought to the subject until that moment, when bloody hatred crawled itself out of her soul. Just as she was about to let those emotions leak out onto her face, Lizzie heard the melody again over the beating of her heart. Sad, but calm. She wasn't sure what John would say to her, but the thought of him soothed her growing rage. Interesting. It was also possible that the girl hadn't wanted to seem too forward, like they had been tracking them. Checking their faces more carefully, Lizzie saw hints of nervousness and forced casualness. She set aside her main concern, flagging it as a potential problem for future consideration. Only a tiny fraction of a second had passed. Lizzie gave them both an apologetic smile.
That's very kind of you, but it's kind of hard for us to have much of a social life. We're trying to get our degrees quickly.
Oh, that's a shame. The offer's still open, though.
Let your husband know, okay?
Okay. With that, Lizzie brushed past them as quickly as she could without seeming rude. Despite the potential threat, a new source of danger to consider, she also felt a little warm. People thought they were married? They were often together on campus, but Lizzie had thought she'd restrained the majority of her affection for when they were alone. The warmth drained away slowly as Lizzie went about her business, though. They still weren't married. John was willing to tie the knot, but the thought of it made her heart leap into her chest. It had nothing to do with the idea of being with him. Lizzie berated herself for the very thought, and everything to do with how she was sure that the wedding would draw bad luck to them somehow. At first, she hadn't wanted to get married because she was afraid that the official record would draw Koitek down on them somehow. But over 2 years had passed since the violent incident, and it was clear that they had escaped. Enrolling in college hadn't drawn any negative attention either, so it was safe for them to get married. Oh yeah, so I just want to comment here. So the Koitek thing that they're talking about, I believe that they were actually both kind of captured essentially by Koitek, but they had managed to escape the facilities, and that's why they had run away, because Koitek was kind of after them. But it's kind of interesting how her rage is being calmed by this melody that she's talking about, which is supposedly the thought of John. So that's kind of interesting in terms of character development, because beforehand she would have more than likely not hesitated to kill that girl. I believe I already read that. Okay. And yet, something would go wrong. Even if they didn't invite anyone, she was sure that someone would ruin their day. And while no one could possibly ruin their relationship, she would only have one wedding day, and she wanted it to be perfect. Suddenly, the people around her were too many. Faceless, soulless creatures moving past her indifferently. The drone of their voices drowned out the melody. Stopping in place, Lizzie frowned, struggling to regain it. But his melody had drifted out of her mind, and no amount of thinking about the joy she felt with him would bring it back. Checking the time, Lizzie decided she had enough before she needed to get to class. Normally, she preferred to arrive early, but that was no longer her priority. The gentle buzz of class, which she usually found passable, if a pale second to being with him, would now only disrupt her. It was difficult to hold herself back, but Lizzie managed to sprint across the campus no faster than an ordinary runner. This wasn't the first time, and someone from the track team had actually tried to recruit her. That was unacceptable. The track uniforms were flattering, but everyone would be wearing them. Of course, he would come to events to be supportive, but that meant his eyes would be assaulted by the entire female track team. That could not be allowed. Oh, the fucking mouse is moving on its own! Oh, the mouse is moving on its own! No. Okay, so we have to kill the track team just to be safe. Let it go. Let it go, Lizzie. John would want you to let it go. Okay, we gotta let that go. Jesus. Lizzie gripped her forehead with both hands, forcing the thought away. She didn't need to do that anymore. The hollowness within her grew and grew as she left campus. Fortunately, their little apartment was nearby. A split home provided as housing for couples. It had taken serious work to obtain one despite not being married, as the fools in admission thought there was a chance she and John might break up. Since it was 2:52, John was likely to be reading for a class. He had referenced a paper being due soon, but he never went down to the computer lab until she was in class. After all, he knew that she might need him. His consideration made a warm glow spread through Lizzie, but that wasn't enough. She needed to see him. She had her key in hand as she approached the door, but it was already unlocked, almost as if he had known. Lizzie threw it open and rushed inside. John sat down on the couch, reading a textbook. He looked perfect, and when he glanced up at the noise and saw her there, gasping for breath with her eyes wild, he just gave a comfortable smile. "Everything all right, Lizzie?"
Of course it is. I just forgot a book I needed for class.
She swept up to him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders to give him a slow kiss. The sight of him had calmed her considerably, and Lizzie tried to keep the desperation out of the kiss. Yes, this warm intimacy with him was what she needed. There was no sense giving him anything to worry about. She'd found him, her perfect person. Lizzie drew back slightly and rested her forehead against his, her heart filled with warmth and his melody strong in her mind once again. "I love you, Lizzie."
It made her heart flutter just as much as the first time he'd said it. "I love you too, John. More than anything."
But as happy as she was to reply, she sensed that something wasn't quite right. There was a bit of tension in his eyes. Was he carrying some weight? Depression? Had someone done something to him? No. Lizzie realized that wasn't it. He was looking at her with concern, having sensed some part of her neediness. It was wonderful that he was so attentive, but the idea that she caused him any pain broke her heart. "Is there anything you want to talk about?" Alright, encourage him, bring up something else, ask indirectly, or explain fully. Ooh, I don't know. I definitely think that the best course to go here is to explain fully. So let's do that.
"Well, there was this couple."
She explained the encounter, hesitating a moment to give him her full thoughts, but eventually sharing. As expected, he wasn't disturbed by her fears and didn't tell her that she was wrong. John had been through too much with her after all.
"You think it was nothing unusual?"
Judging from what you said, they just sound lonely to me. They probably just wanted to find people they have something in common with.
Maybe.
But
even if that's true, I still don't want them anywhere near us. They're probably stupid, evil people, John. All we need is the two of us.
He smiled ruefully, but there was real affection in his expression too. John pulled her into a quick embrace and squeezed her tight. "If that's how you feel, we don't need to interact with other people. I kind of want to just keep my head down and graduate anyway."
"I agree."
She cuddled with him for a moment longer, nestling her head against his chest, then reluctantly pulled back, watching her hair as it clung to him. Though she longed to stay, she knew that it was better to go to class. Maximizing time in the short term would only hinder their long-term objectives, and she wanted as much of him as she could possibly get. Lizzie headed to their bedroom and traded one spiral notebook for another, feeling a moment of guilt at the deception. But no, it was better this way. She could take the burden onto herself and leave his life lighter. She left with a kiss and a cheery wave, but then crept around the side of the apartment. She had left a little earlier than necessary to arrive to class on time for this very purpose. From the perfect angle, she could see him through the window, going back to his book, studying so seriously to help them have a better life together. Lizzie didn't try to hide the broad smile on her face, just spent a while watching him. There's a less need to watch him now that they were together, but she still enjoyed it. Once she had been observed, and the other girl had made the despicable assumption that Lizzie was concerned that he would cheat on her, as if such a thing was possible, as if she needed any reason except to look at him. She did like to observe him sometimes to make sure he wasn't sad again. John's depression was mostly under control now that he had abandoned the awful Koitek medicine, but she knew it was part of him that needed to be watched. The thought of his inner sadness made Lizzie want to run back inside and kiss him again, forget class and just spend the night making love until he looked only happy and relaxed. I'm going to turn down the volume just a little bit. Reluctantly, Lizzie pulled herself away and headed toward the lecture hall. John was mentally healthy. He wouldn't forget about her love just because she was away for a little while. She'd made sure of that. She arrived just a little late, but it was a relaxed university and no one cared too much. Lizzie carefully set out her books and focused on the lesson. There were worse things in classes. If the universe declared that she couldn't spend every single moment with him, she needed something else to fill her time. With a few exceptions like psychology, classes weren't obnoxious at all. A few even provided knowledge that might have utility in the future. And if all of it had some utility in getting them closer to their degrees. Once, it had been difficult for Lizzie to think about such long-term plans, but now she could see how both of them earning degrees would help them create the life they wanted. But after that, things became more tangled in her mind. She wanted to be with him. She wanted whatever he wanted. But he was convinced that they should take jobs in the industry, play some small role in preventing pharmaceutical giants like Koitek from doing anything as terrible as they'd done at their old high school, or the experiment they had done that had led to Lizzie's existence. The idea that John wanted to make sure there would never be anyone else like her, that she would be the only one. It made her tingle all over. She didn't think he would approve of that thought, but she liked it so much that she kept it to herself. But the idea of getting involved with Koitek again, even indirectly, still left her. She wanted what he wanted, of course, a life together. They would have that, no matter what they chose. It would be fine. For once, Lizzie set such thoughts aside and focused fully on class. After the lecture finished, Lizzie practically skipped out of the hall. It had been her last class of the day, and John had likely finished the work that he needed to do in the computer lab. That left them the rest of the day to themselves. So she wouldn't have to leave him again. Lizzie stopped by the store first, since they were low on food. It hurt her pride as a cook that they had to eat ramen, but money was tight. The least she could do was purchase cheap vegetables and enhance the experience. As she picked out appropriate ones, Lizzie carefully kept track of her spending versus the amount of money she had left. She had aged out of child support. Not that the man who had impregnated her mother had ever been reliable, which combined with college expenses left her in a more difficult financial situation than ever before in her life. She was careful to add everything up in her head so that she would still have enough money to drop by the pharmacy after getting their groceries. There was a small, locally owned one that she felt comfortable getting John's depression medication, though it seemed to be getting more expensive these days. Of course, she still did own Abby's home in their hometown, but Lizzie wanted to avoid anything to do with it in case Koitek was watching, and John would never want to live there anyway. Perhaps after they graduated, she could sell the house for a down payment on their own. That idea gave her a pleasant hum of emotions as she finished her errands and headed back home, still with a spring in her step. But when Lizzie arrived, she found the door locked. She quickly pulled out her key, added another scratch mark to the lock before successfully opening it. The apartment was empty, briefly making her heart hammer in her chest. There was a note on the table and she seized it, eyes flickering over the words. John had gone to the computer lab and said he hoped to be back before she was, but that it might be longer, so she had an explanation. But even as Lizzie breathed a sigh of relief, part of her mind began to churn with other thoughts. What if this was some kind of excuse? No, John would never do such a thing. Never. Lizzie crumpled the paper in her hands, then nervously tried to smooth it out again. John would never betray her. She knew that now. Carried that fact tightly in her heart. But the world was filled with awful people. Terrible women who might try to seduce him. And even if he pushed them away, the idea of one of them laying a hand on him. And what if Koitek got a hold of him somehow? They'd already tried it once, to use him to get her. She thought they were safe now, but what if she was wrong? Once again, Lizzie might have flown out the door and hunted him down until she would be sure that he was safe. Now she found herself pacing, fingers tangling in her hair as she tried to quiet the thoughts screaming in her head. On a whim, Lizzie grabbed the extra spiral notebook she had taken out and slammed it down on the table. She began furiously writing everything in her head, letting the thoughts out to give herself a little relief. She'd done this once before she'd met him. Just like she'd collected pictures of him. Now that she had the real thing, she'd neglected such habits, but they had helped her once. Perhaps they could again. Finally, she was done. Lizzie took a deep breath and looked over the page of furious scribbling. Some of the thoughts there embarrassed her. She needed to trust him utterly, but it was good to get them out of her head and onto paper. She felt calm again, and the memory wafted from the deep recesses of her soul, the place where she kept him, comforting her even now. Though the page was a mess, she had returned from the edge. Lizzie realized that she was gripping a knife in her other hand. After a pause, she set it down. Though her mind was clear, she still didn't know what to do. Obviously, John would never cheat on her. He had been very considerate to leave a note, and no doubt that explained the situation. It was also unlikely that anything terrible had happened to him. She still missed him, though, and wanted to drown the rest of her fears in his presence. It was possible that he would be unhappy if his work had gone on too long, and might be happy to see her. Lizzie closed the notebook and put it with her others, considering what she should do. Start making dinner, wait for him, or go meet him at the computer lab. I don't know. I mean, I feel like we might as well make some dinner, right? When he comes home, we have a nice little dinner prepared for him. That'd be nice. It made her anxious not to take action, but Lizzie kept herself from leaving. Instead, she set about making dinner, trying not to watch the door or listen too closely for his arrival. Lizzie set about cutting up the vegetables, removing the bad portions and reducing the rest to appetizing chunks. Her knife flickered satisfyingly, perfectly balanced for her hand. They might need to make do in many ways, but she had excellent kitchen knives to work with. Even when money was tight, he had never suggested selling her knife collection. She would have, though, would have gladly sold every single knife and every single thing she owned for his sake. Knife still flying, Lizzie frowned to herself. No, that wasn't right. She needed her axe and a few knives to defend him properly. Plus, John wouldn't want her to give up anything like that. Everything like that. Oh yeah, you see a bunch of knives around the place. You have a knife on the table, a butcher's knife on the drawer there. You have a knife in all the apples, a knife over there in the kitchen, a bunch of knives on the wall. Oh, did I miss something? Considering such warm thoughts, Lizzie flipped her knife around in her hand a few unnecessary times as she finished cutting. Not the kind of thing she could do in public, but at home there was no one to see her but John, and he wouldn't be afraid of her. It might be too early to cook anything, so Lizzie set the chopped vegetables aside and converted the rest into a salad. She smiled to herself, but realized that she was out of preparations. Her gaze wandered toward the door. Fortunately, at that very moment, she heard his footsteps outside. Lizzie was torn between rushing to greet him and waiting by her work, which made her hesitate long enough for him to enter. Sorry, I got held back.
That's not a problem at all. I've gotten things ready for dinner.
Looks like you've been busy. I'm really hungry. So is eating early fine?
Of course.
Since she'd done her preparations already, Lizzie just set the water on to boil and added a few other flourishes. John set the table and she beamed at him, happy to be working together. Eventually, they both sat down together on opposite sides of their small table. It was nothing much, but it was theirs, and that was wonderful. She would have been happy to just sit and watch him eat, but she knew that he loved to talk to her even more. The idea that he wanted her to open herself up to him, even her darkest thoughts, always made her happy. But for today, she had nothing particularly dark on her mind.
So, you imply that you got held up in the lab?
Mostly it was nothing unusual. Just had to answer some questions. But Dan caught me at the end, wanted me to switch shifts at the library. He wanted me to do tonight, which I said I wouldn't work. So we had to do some weird rescheduling. Blech.
Hasn't that been happening a lot lately?
Yeah, and I might be picking up even more shifts. Figure it can't hurt, right? No, but she didn't like him to be away from home more often. Lizzie had to admit that the library job was a good one, allowing him to study or read most of the time, but she still didn't like it. At least she could visit him without being a hindrance. Why did he feel the need to work so much, though? Lizzie had her own campus job, and the numbers of their debt weren't too awful thanks to scholarships. Would it be better if they could get rid of it? Maybe she should consider going back to the house and selling it after all. Though she considered asking him all these questions, Lizzie decided to hold back. John had many concerns of his own, and adding her anxiety to those might make him depressed again. She was stronger, so it was better for her to shoulder the burden. After dinner, they moved to the couch to work. It was a ratty old thing they'd gotten off a curb, but it was fairly soft and it served to hold them. They sat on opposite sides, each with their textbooks, their feet touching in between. Just being able to be so near him, so comfortably. Lizzie slid her feet against his leg and gave him a bright smile when he looked up at her. An old part of her wanted to act immediately, to have sex before the moment could pass, but they had been together for 2 years, and moments like this were hardly a rare thing. Slowly, her mind had learned that she didn't need to be desperate. The life she wanted with him was filled with moments like this too. Despite her thoughts circling around him, Lizzie finished her work rather quickly, because of it in a sense. There was a purpose to so many activities that had once been just going through the motions. Lizzie saw he was still busy working and spent a little while admiring him. She loved that look of concentration as he became fully absorbed with something. It was even better when it was directly towards her, but just his concentration was cute too. She could have watched forever, but when she got her fill, Lizzie stood up. She kissed him on the cheek, then headed to the other side of the apartment. They didn't have a lot of space, but there was enough for her to retrieve her axe from the cupboard and experiment with it a little. She hadn't experienced any more physical instability since the incident, leaving her very capable of protecting him, but she needed to be cautious. Though she didn't like to think about it, Lizzie had to admit that there was a small chance she could hurt John by accident. Even if they had never had a serious conflict with Koitek again, she needed her knives to feel secure. The idea that she might cause the slightest injury by accident. Lizzie practiced carefully, both following through with all the force she could muster and bringing the axe to a halt at a moment's notice. The practice was soothing, and Lizzie found herself smiling. There had been a time in her life after she found him when it had been possible that she might harm him, in order to preserve their love, though those thoughts now struck her as alien and horrible. She would never hurt him. Never. But that meant she needed to always be prepared. When Lizzie finished, she discovered that John was watching her. She had no doubt that her expression was far from inviting, as she had been imagining cutting down threats to them, but he was watching her fondly. Lizzie beamed at him and returned her axe to its place.
Are you done studying?
For tonight, yeah. There's no point doing more since I can read at work tomorrow.
Then...
She drifted closer to him, smile broadening as she pored over his face. He wasn't too tired. He made a point of saying his work was done, and though he had been watching her with gentle affection, she knew there was more there. Lizzie eagerly slid down into his lap, her body pressing up against his. Soon she could feel the proof of his desire in his pants, and she cooed happily. But though he put his arms around her waist, his eyes still watched her carefully. I know you need to get up tomorrow. I know you need to get up early tomorrow, though. Do you want to? Have sex? Don't have sex. I can't even move away from have sex. I guess we're having sex, baby. Grinning, Lizzie leaned in closer and kissed him. There had been so many small kisses throughout the day, each adding a little warmth inside her, and now she returned it all, kissing him deeply and passionately. His hands tightened on her waist, holding her a little closer. Most of the hesitance and uncertainty were gone now, since they were familiar with each other's bodies. She had never had trouble, needing him too much to be hesitant, but John moved more slowly. It sent a thrill through her every time he touched her confidently. As he bent closer to him, and there was a loud knock on the door. Her eyes narrowed to slits, and she glared murdered towards the entrance. We don't have to answer. Another knock. Louder. No, ignoring it was not an option. Lizzie sprang up from his lap and wrenched open the door. The boy on the other side was someone she recognized from one of John's classes. John said he was intelligent, and Lizzie didn't find him annoying, so under normal circumstances he was fine. At the moment, she felt only rage toward him, barely contained within her smile. He was physically fit, but no threat. Her axe could be in her hand before her... Hey, Aaron, what's up? You guys want to check the news? Francesca Kelsey's gonna... seriously do it. It took Lizzie a moment to identify the name. A public figure, not someone they knew. Related to the pharmaceutical industry. Not an immediate threat, but an annoyance at this moment. The news seemed to matter to John, so he had to turn on the salvage TV in the corner. Lizzie reluctantly acknowledged that Aaron was going to be an entity in their life at least for a little while, and allowed him to step inside. After flipping to the right channel, John watched carefully as the news report ran. Aaron slouched against the nearby wall, leaving Lizzie to hover behind John. When she heard Koitek's name, she began to pay full attention, soaking up the information. The study they're talking about. What did we miss?
They didn't go into detail, but something about how sloppy pharmaceutical experiments used to be. A whole town of people got sick. Bad stuff. Lizzie's heart began to beat rapidly. Was it possible that the report mentioned her? No, not her specifically. There were privacy concerns, but it might have referenced her experiment. Lizzie's fingers began to twitch at her sides, which drew John's attention. He frowned a little, then returned to Aaron. How many cases did they talk about? Anything involving specific individuals? Just general information that I heard. Why? Exactly the question that Lizzie had been afraid of, but John didn't seem too disturbed. I used to be part of a Paxitine trial that didn't go well, at least for me. I was wondering if it got mentioned. Oh, is that how you got clued into all this? Behind them, Lizzie let her fingers slowly relax. John had been thinking of her, hadn't exposed her to any unnecessary attention. Of course he would. She was awful for doubting him. While she was feeling a warm glow, she missed John's response. Well, anyway, they only emphasized the biggest cases. Kelsey's trying to prove that the harms are large enough that government policy needs to change. So that's how it connected. Francesca Kelsey was a researcher who used to work for the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Administration, but left as part of a protest. She had been campaigning for increased powers to regulate pharmaceutical megacorporations since then. Lizzie usually didn't have many opinions about politics, but she approved in this case if it did damage to Koitek. She had never seen the woman herself, though. Lizzie watched curiously until the news station played a clip of Francesca speaking about the report, then began chewing on one knuckle. Though Francesca appeared serious and dressed professionally, she was too young for Lizzie's taste. Maybe it was fine for John to pay attention to her, since she was doing important work related to both of them, but his attention focusing on anyone else made Lizzie anxious. This is good to know, but why run over here? The congressional debates are going to take forever. Oh, that wasn't the urgent part. They said it earlier. Kelsey's going on a speaking tour trying to raise awareness of the issue. But not all locations are set. We need to get her on campus, man. Ah, I get it. I don't know how much help we can be, though. Well, I wanted to ask if you'd join again. We need more people to lead us if we're going to gain any momentum. John hesitated, looking towards her. His mouth had opened slightly as if to ask something, but he saw the tension in her eyes. Aaron looked back too, but Lizzie had pulled her finger from her mouth, and he couldn't see past her smile. It's going to be hard for us to commit to that, I think. But keep us informed about what happens, okay? Alright, I won't press. I'm going to get Kelsey here, though. Surely we're a big enough campus. While John made small talk and walked Aaron out, Lizzie stayed in front of the television and kept watching the broadcast. Koitek had tried to take John away from her. She had feared 1,000 things, and many times he had calmed her fears, but back then, she'd been absolutely right. An intellectual part of her knew that it was a huge corporation, manufacturing many common drugs. Not all of them were as ill-advised as Paxitine. Not every experiment was harmful. Not every employee could be as terrible as Miss Smith. It didn't matter. Lizzie hated all of them. But she couldn't hack apart the entire corporation, so she had no choice but to hope that something could be done. That was why she didn't mind people like Aaron so much. They could be useful. Maybe even this Francesca. But that didn't mean Lizzie wanted her to come here, especially since she might bring attention from Koitek. Was this what she had been fearing? That was why they couldn't get married. Not with an event like this looming in the future. Not while something could go wrong. All too soon, the broadcast moved to other subjects. Though the pharmaceutical giants were becoming increasingly important to everyday life, they were still usually ignored compared to the banal, celebrity news. Lizzie didn't care about that, since random foolish celebrities wouldn't attract John's eye. She still moved to turn the television off, though. When she had turned back, she discovered John watching her with concern. She had been aware that John had left, of course, but that was at the periphery of her thoughts. Only now did she reflect on the amount of time that had passed. You worried about it?
I'm just afraid something will happen. Koitek will be watching.
John approached and wrapped his arms around her. Lizzie eagerly let herself rest against his chest. Maybe, but everyone will be watching. Francesca Kelsey is one of their main political opponents, so they have to know that anything around her will be scrutinized, even if Aaron gets her to come. I'm sure it'll pass without incident.
That was logical. It was probably true. And though Lizzie cut and recut his sentence a dozen different ways, she didn't discern any real affection when he spoke the other woman's name. She was just a political figure working on an important cause. No more. She wasn't the threat. Alright, I think I'm going to stop it there for right now. And we're going to return to the main menu there. Alright, so definitely interesting here. So for one, it seems like Lizzie's definitely gained a lot more control over her mental state, as well as the fact that we're actually playing as Lizzie now. Because in the first game we played as John, but obviously the roles have reversed. So what is kind of interesting to me, though, is the fact that she seemingly, obviously John has become very important in keeping her mental, like, stability here. And she's able to logically think things through this time, unlike in the last game where it was very irrational and kind of purely based on emotions. And I also kind of like the mechanic where it's like forcing me to choose one option and not the other. Kind of like very obviously telling me, hey, this is what we want to do here. So definitely lots of interesting, not necessarily mechanics, but character development, like I said earlier. And I'm interested to see where this story goes. I'm interested, again, I'm not sure whether this is going to be a story about them kind of once and for all taking down Koitek, or if this is just going to be, you know, further development of their relationship. But anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a thumbs up on it and tell me in the comment section below what you would like to see me play next. If you enjoyed this video or any other videos or series on my channel, then I highly recommend that you hit the subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you'll be notified when one of those videos comes out. Anyways, that's it for me, and I'll see you in the next one.